The record that survives is a fragment, one page, torn from a register, its edges blackened by heat, its ink smudged by damp, yet still legible enough to whisper of what was to come. It bears a date, July 31st. Beneath it, the signature of a local magistrate who would himself not live to see the end of August. The handwriting is uneven, as if written in haste, or by a man who knew that what he was putting to paper could destroy him. The entry notes only that a strange occurrence had been reported by the Crenshaw household, the sighting of a wooden cross nailed crookedly to the gate of their plantation. The cross was roughly hewn, no longer than a man's arm, and darkened by something more viscous than tar. No explanation accompanied it. No culprit was named. Only a single line at the bottom. The family is unnerved. They demand protection. It was the first of 17 such crosses, though no one knew it then. The Crenshaw plantation. The Crenshaw family was among the oldest in Halifax County, their lineage stretching back to a Revolutionary War officer who had secured thousands of acres from the collapsing Tuscarora nation. By 1835, old Colonel Richard Crenshaw had been dead a decade, leaving his son Henry Elias Crenshaw to manage the estate. Henry was known in town as proud, fond of French wines, and equally fond of public lectures condemning abolitionists as disturbers of the natural order. Beneath him lived 74 enslaved men, women, and children, their names rarely preserved, except in bills of sale or inventories drawn up for insurance. The ledgers list them alongside cattle and tools, yet whispers passed from one cabin to another carried far richer memories than paper, and within those whispers, the name of one man recurs like a refrain: Josiah, the preacher in the pines. Josiah was not Crenshaw's property. He belonged, at least by law, to the smaller Tolland estate 5 miles west. But like many enslaved men who had gained a reputation for preaching, he moved between plantations with a freedom that unsettled the local gentry. By day he cut timber, repaired fences, and did the 1,000 nameless tasks expected of a field hand. By night he stood beneath the trees, a Bible in one hand and a voice that seemed to draw the very night air into itself. Those who remembered him decades later described his sermons not as shouting, but as something lower, more deliberate, an insistence that God's justice was not delayed forever, that Egypt had fallen, that Babylon had burned, that Rome itself had crumbled under the weight of its arrogance. The enslaved gathered to hear him in secret, women clutching infants to their breasts, men keeping watch for patrols with dogs and lantern. His words were dangerous, not because they promised paradise in the afterlife, but because they suggested that divine judgment could arrive here upon the soil of Carolina, with fire and blood. White observers noticed him too. In 1832, Reverend Albright, a Baptist minister sympathetic to gradual emancipation, wrote in his diary, "There is among the Negroes a fellow called Josiah, who proclaims with greater eloquence than any white preacher of my acquaintance. His doctrine is terrible, vengeance and upheaval, yet his manner compels attention." By 1835, Josiah's reputation was so widespread that planters forbade their slaves from attending his gatherings. Still they came, slipping into the woods like shadows, and it was in those woods, some later claimed, that Josiah first described a vision, a county purged by crosses, 17 in all, one for each master who had ground human lives beneath his heel. August approaches. The summer of 1835 was oppressive. Records note heat waves that wilted crops and sent livestock mad with thirst. Tempers frayed, rumors swelled. Stories of Nat Turner's revolt in Virginia, 4 years earlier, had never been fully silent. Even those who professed confidence in the loyalty of our Negroes began to sharpen their pistols and count their cartridges by lamplight. On August 2nd, another cross appeared, this time at the gate of the Tolland estate, Josiah's legal master. The overseer swore that no man had passed the road that night, that the dogs gave no alarm, yet by dawn the sign was there. The local newspaper, the Carolina Gazette, reported the matter cautiously on page 4. Vandalism, possibly by itinerant freedmen, has unsettled the community. Vigilance is urged. Few readers then understood that these crude symbols marked the beginning of a design far more elaborate than petty mischief. By the middle of August, 5 households bore the mark. At each, Unease spread like contagion. Families who once scorned the idea of locking doors now barred them with heavy timbers. Children were forbidden from wandering after sunset. The county militia began informal patrols, muttering that perhaps the governor should be alerted. Yet still no culprit was apprehended. The diary of Eleanor Crenshaw. Of all the surviving documents, none are as haunting as the fragments of a diary kept by Eleanor Crenshaw, Henry's wife, preserved by descendants who later attempted to destroy it. Her words offer a rare glimpse into the atmosphere of dread that deepened as August waned. August 14th. Henry has forbidden me from attending to the children's lessons at the schoolhouse, saying it is He will not say why, but I overheard the men speaking of the wooden sign nailed to the Tollins door. Our own was the first, and yet they give us no protection. I pray nightly but feel my prayers rise only to a blackened sky. August 20th. At supper one of the servants dropped a plate. Henry struck him so fiercely that the child cried out in terror. Later I found the servant praying under the willow tree. He spoke of crosses in the night. I fear his prayers are not for our deliverance. These entries were later dismissed by apologists as hysterical fancy, yet when read against the timeline of events, they map uncannily onto the crescendo of the conspiracy. A pattern emerges. By August 23rd, 12 plantations had received the cross. The symbols were no longer nailed at gates, but sometimes driven into the very earth of the yards, as if witnesses described them as sticky to the touch, reeking faintly of iron. Local physicians who examined one insisted it was stained with animal blood, though others whispered it was not from beasts. The psychological effect was devastating. Every rustle in the cane, every creak of timber became a threat. Enslaved laborers, aware of their master's growing panic, adopted a silence so profound that it was itself terrifying. They look at us with eyes that seem to hold secrets, wrote one overseer in a letter to his cousin. I confess, I dread them. The magistrate's report. At last on August 25th, the county magistrate Samuel R. Dobbins compiled a report for Raleigh. Only the opening survives, the rest lost to fire decades later. There is strong reason to believe a plot of unusual sophistication is unfolding within Halifax County. It involves symbols of the cross, chosen with deliberate blasphemy, and has spread across no less than 12 estates. The matter is grave. Unless immediate action is taken, we may witness calamity unprecedented in this state. Within 72 hours of that letter, calamity arrived. August 28, 1835. At dawn, smoke was seen rising from the Pritchard plantation. By noon, news had reached town. The entire household had been slaughtered, their doors marked with a cross darker and broader than the rest. That same night, the Tollins fell, their overseer nailed to the barn wall beside the sign. By the morning of August 29th, 4 families lay dead. 17 in all would perish before the month's end, each household marked, each death echoing the preacher's prophecy whispered in the pines. The county would never be the same, nor would America. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The massacre at the Pritchard and Tolland estates shattered the illusion that Halifax County could manage its troubles quietly. The newspapers would later call it a sudden storm of barbarity, but those who survived swore the storm had been brewing for months, if not years. Every planter knew, deep down, that the wealth beneath their feet was built on a graveyard, and that the men and women forced to till their fields had not forgotten their debt. Now, with smoke still curling above the blackened chimneys of 2 great houses, fear spread like wildfire through the county. Families who once entertained neighbors with wine and song barred themselves inside their mansions, rifles stacked by the door. Children hushed into silence. Even the most boastful masters, who only weeks before declared their slaves docile, now walked with loaded pistols tucked beneath their coats. It was at this moment that Cedar Grove, the Crenshaw estate, became the unwilling heart of the crisis. Eleanor's vigil. In her diary, Eleanor Crenshaw's tone shifted from anxious to despairing. Her entries around August 28th are written in trembling script, words crowded into the margins, as if she had too much to confess before the candle burned out. Henry tells me we are safe, but I see the strain in his face. He rides out daily with the other men, leaving us in this house too large for comfort, too empty for prayer. The children sense it. Even little Martha asks me if we are going to die like the Pritchards. How am I to answer? Tonight I heard singing from the quarters, low, steady, rising and falling. It was no hymn I knew. There was no joy in it, only something like mourning, yet I could not say for who. Scholars who later examined these lines argued that Eleanor, though blind to its meaning, had overheard the coded messages passed in song, laments that doubled as signals, grief that veiled resolve. Josiah's counsel, meanwhile, accounts from the enslaved themselves preserved only through oral retellings, written down decades later, describe Josiah's growing influence. He was no longer merely a preacher offering visions of divine justice. He was, they claimed, a counselor, a strategist. One elderly woman interviewed in 1891 recalled, "He said we must move like the Jordan River, quiet at first, but swelling till nothing can stand in its way. He told us the masters had chosen death when they chose chains for us." Another source, a free black carpenter named Laban, remembered Josiah visiting his workshop under the pretense of buying nails for fences. "He asked me about building signs, how deep you must drive a post to keep it standing. He did not say crosses, but I knew." What emerges is a portrait of a man who merged theology with tactics, faith with fury. He did not simply dream of vengeance, he prepared it. The secret meetings, testimony gathered after the revolt, some under duress, some whispered in confidence, described gatherings in the pine woods that ringed the Crenshaw estate, always at night, always at a different place, with lookouts posted at every approach. Fires were forbidden, torches smothered. The moon was their only light. There, Josiah spoke not of salvation in heaven, but of liberation on earth. He recited passages from Exodus with such intensity that even those who could not read felt they were inscribed on their very bone. "And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you." That verse, repeated again and again, became a password of sorts. Later, when crosses appeared daubed with blood, their meaning was unmistakable to those who had heard him preach. Whispers in the town, the white population meanwhile, groped for explanations. Some blamed northern abolitionist pamphlets smuggled into the county. Others insisted it was the work of outside agitators, men of mixed blood, who wandered from port town. Yet the more perceptive among them began to suspect the truth. This was no foreign incitement, but a plan conceived and executed by men who lived among them every day, men they had assumed too ignorant, too broken to conceive rebellion. Nathaniel Hartwell, a physician, who treated several wounded survivors, wrote to his brother, "The most disturbing fact is not the slaughter itself, but the methodical nature of it. These were not acts of madness, but of design. The crosses are no random mark. They are a theology carved in wood, a sermon left at the doorstep. Whoever leads them has learning, and worse still, conviction." Hartwell's words would later be cited in abolitionist tracts across the North, proof that enslaved people possessed not only strength of body, but clarity of mind. Marcus's burden, among the enslaved at Cedar Grove, was a young man named Marcus, remembered in both white records and black memory. Only 25, he was said to be unusually literate, having secretly learned his letters from Eleanor's discarded primer. He had once been whipped nearly to death for writing his own name. During the uprising, Marcus occupied a strange position, close enough to Josiah to hear his plans, yet bound to the Crenshaws by the peculiar intimacy of house service. Later testimony claimed that Josiah entrusted Marcus with carrying messages between plantations. Whether Marcus did so willingly or under pressure is uncertain. His descendants insisted he acted from survival, caught between two powers, both demanding loyalty. In Eleanor's diary, a cryptic entry appears. August 27th. "Marcus looks at me strangely. I cannot say why, but I feel he knows something we do not. When I asked if he was troubled, he bowed his head and said, 'The night is long, mistress, but the morning come.' I shivered, though the air was warm. Panic in the parlor. By the last week of August, Cedar Grove became a fortress. Henry Crenshaw and his neighbors gathered nightly in the parlor, pistols and muskets laid across the table beside their decanters of brandy. Maps were spread, names whispered, suspicions sharpened into accusations. Some demanded a sweep of the quarters, but others hesitated, for what if their worst fear was confirmed? A letter from Major Thomas Belling, preserved in the state archives, describes one such gathering. "It is my conviction that this plot has leadership, and that the man Josiah is at its head. Yet when I proposed we seize him, Crenshaw demurred, claiming it would provoke more violence. Thus we sit in paralysis, while the crosses breed like weeds. Fear divided them more effectively than any sword. While they debated, the conspiracy advanced. The 13th cross. On the night of August 26th, the 13th cross appeared, this time driven into the earth,
at the edge of Cedar Grove itself. Eleanor claimed she saw it from her chamber window, pale in the moonlight, glistening as though freshly anointed. Henry tore it from the ground and burned it, cursing whoever had dared to approach his land. But by morning, another stood in its place. "We are haunted," Eleanor wrote, "either by men or by something darker. The cross will not leave us." The gathering storm. By August 27th, Halifax was a county under siege. The militia doubled its patrols. Riders carried frantic messages to Raleigh. Every hour seemed to bring new rumors, that hundreds of slaves were marching through the woods, that Richmond itself had sent troops, that Josiah had been seen walking on water like Christ. Much of it was hysteria, but within the hysteria lay enough truth to sharpen the terror. For the enslaved knew that blood had already been shed, that the balance of fear had shifted, if only for a moment, and the masters knew it too. In the shadow of that knowledge, Cedar Grove waited, trapped between dread and denial. Eleanor's pen fell silent. After August, no further entries survive. 3 days later, 17 masters would be dead. The last days of August 1835 unfolded, with the dread inevitability of a storm pressing inland. To the enslaved, it felt like prophecy advancing toward fulfillment. To the masters, it was a nightmare they could neither comprehend nor control. The 13th cross at Cedar Grove was not the end of the warnings, but the beginning of the revelation. The standoff at Cedar Grove, on the evening of August 28th, with the sky streaked in red twilight, Sheriff Davies arrived at Cedar Grove, with 24 armed men. They had come not for comfort, but for confrontation. Their intelligence, drawn from frightened whispers and intercepted messages, suggested that Josiah, the enigmatic preacher, was the architect of the slaughter at Pritchard and Tarleton. Inside the mansion, Eleanor Crenshaw clutched her children, while her husband, Henry, argued furiously with the sheriff. "You would bring war into my house," Henry cried, slamming his fist on the mantel. Davies replied with weary pragmatism, "War is already here, Henry. You just haven't admitted it."
Even as they spoke, the kitchen erupted in chaos. A dozen armed men forced their way inside, dragging Eleanor forward like a shield. At their center stood Josiah, the preacher's voice calm, his eyes burning with an intensity that froze even the bravest of the militia. In his hand was a knife, its edge glinting as it pressed against Eleanor's throat. "My story is written in blood." The standoff that followed was recorded in multiple testimonies, each colored by fear, loyalty, or hindsight. Yet all agreed on one thing. Josiah spoke with a conviction that silenced the room. "You come with guns and promises of trials," he told Sheriff Davies, "but what court will hear me? What jury will weigh the life of a slave against the life of a master? You call it justice, I call it mockery." His grip tightened, drawing a thin red line along Eleanor's pale skin. "My story is written already. Written in children torn from their mothers. Written in backs bent under cane and cotton. Written in the silence of graves dug by broken hands. You would deny that story in your court, but you will not deny it here." The room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus steps forward. Among the captives stood Marcus, the young man who had carried Josiah's messages. His loyalty had long been questioned by both sides, and now his choice would define him forever. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped toward Josiah, hands open in peace. His voice trembled, but his words carried weight. "Brother Josiah," he said, using the title the preacher preferred, "you taught us that God moves through men. You said each of us is his instrument. Perhaps Dr. Hartwell," he nodded toward the physician who had accompanied the sheriff, "is an instrument too. Perhaps your task is not to kill, but to speak, so that the world will finally hear." For the first time, Josiah's shoulders sagged. The rage that had sustained him seemed to drain away, replaced by exhaustion so deep it bent his frame. He released Eleanor, the knife clattering to the floor. His voice, when it came, was quiet but unshakable. "My name is not Reverend Josiah Cumberland. My name is Josiah Freeman. I was born a slave on the Dandridge plantation in Virginia. 20 years ago they sold my wife Sarah and our 3 children to a trader bound for Georgia. I never saw them again." The shock of revelation, the admission fell upon the room like a thunderclap. For years the Crenshaws and their neighbors had welcomed Josiah into their parlors, their pulpits, their most intimate gatherings. never once suspecting that the preacher they trusted was a man who had once bent beneath their chain. The disguise was not merely physical but spiritual. He had spoken their language, quoted their scripture, soothed their fears even as he stoked their destruction. To discover that he was a former slave, that he had used their own faith against them, was a humiliation more profound than the blood already spilled. Eleanor, trembling but alive, whispered later that his eyes in that moment were those of a man already dead, yet unwilling to leave the living. The trial of Josiah Freeman. Josiah was seized, bound and dragged from Cedar Grove under heavy guard. His capture did not end the terror, but it gave the white community a symbol of reassurance. Here was the villain, the architect of their nightmares, displayed in chains like a captured beast. Yet when his trial began in early September, the spectacle unsettled more than it soothed. The courthouse overflowed with planters, merchants and curious onlookers. Journalists traveled from as far as Charleston and Boston to witness what many called the most dangerous slave ever brought to bar. Appointed to defend him was a young attorney, Daniel Fletcher, inexperienced yet ambitious. Fletcher quickly realized that Josiah's case was more than a criminal proceeding. It was a stage upon which the human cost of slavery could be unveiled. The testimony of a rebel. For 3 days Josiah Freeman testified in calm, unhurried tone. He spoke not only of his own suffering but of the system that had produced it. "I do not ask for mercy," he declared in his final address. "I ask only that you understand why mercy was made impossible for me. When you turn men into property, do not be surprised when they rise to reclaim their humanity by any means necessary." His words, recorded in court transcripts and newspapers, rippled far beyond Halifax County. For abolitionists they became rallying cry. For slaveholders they were warnings cloaked in prophecy. Eleanor's scandalous defense. Perhaps the most startling testimony came not from Josiah himself, but from Eleanor Crenshaw. Though traumatized by her ordeal, she refused to paint him as a mere monster. Before a hushed court, she described him as a brilliant man driven to extremes by unbearable loss. "He knew our scripture better than our own ministers," she said. "He knew human nature better than our judge. If we had treated our people as human beings rather than property, Josiah Freeman would never have become Reverend Cumberland." Her words scandalized her neighbors. Some called her naive. Others accused her of betraying her class. But her testimony ensured that the trial would not be remembered solely as a condemnation of rebellion, but as an indictment of the very institution that made rebellion inevitable. The verdict. On the third evening, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty on all counts: murder, conspiracy, treason. The sentence was death by hanging. Yet the outcome was never in doubt. What shocked the community was not the verdict, but the unease it left behind. For in condemning Josiah they had also condemned themselves. His testimony had forced them to confront the truth they had long buried, that slavery was not stability but a powder keg, and that men like Josiah Freeman were its inevitable spark. The execution. On October 15, 1835, Josiah Freeman was led to the gallows before a crowd of more than 3,000 spectators. The day was bright, the air sharp with autumn chill. He mounted the scaffold without hesitation, his posture as erect as when he had stood in the pulpit. His final words were delivered not as a plea, but as a sermon. "I go to my death knowing my children, if they yet live, remain in chains. I go knowing that this system will outlast me, that it will tear families apart, and build wealth upon suffering. But I also go knowing that others will rise, perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but one day, this sin will demand its reckoning." The trapdoor fell. Silence followed, broken only by the creak of rope and the murmur of a crowd unsettled by what it had witnessed. The legend begins. Josiah's body was buried in an unmarked grave, but his story did not rest with him. Within weeks, his name had become both a curse and a prophecy. Planters invoked it as a warning. The enslaved whispered it as a promise. Dr. Hartwell, who had stood at Cedar Grove during the standoff, wrote in his private journal, "I saved 17 lives that night, but in saving them I fear I preserved a system that will claim thousands more." The gallows ended a man, but it did not end the truth he carried. The revolt was crushed, the conspirators scattered or executed, yet the memory of Josiah Freeman, preacher, rebel, father, widower, began its long journey into legend. The execution of Josiah Freeman did not extinguish the fire he had lit. Instead, it cast a long, uneasy shadow over Halifax County, and far beyond. What had begun as a string of murders in the summer of 1835 ended not only in blood and gallows but in a haunting legacy that outlived both masters and slaves. The revolt was crushed, the conspirators silenced, but the memory proved immune to rope and blade, silence and suppression. In the weeks after the hanging, white leaders scrambled to control the narrative. Local newspapers, at first eager to sensationalize the story, began receiving stern directives from Raleigh and Richmond. Editors were told to temper reports to avoid panic. The official account framed Josiah as a lunatic preacher, his followers as deranged fanatics. The crosses that had marked doorsteps were dismissed as symbols of witchcraft. Nowhere in these sanctioned retellings was there acknowledgement of his eloquence, his testimony, or the searing accusations he hurled at the system of bondage. But suppression bred curiosity. Farmers whispered his name by firelight. Merchants retold fragments of his speeches in hushed tones. Even planters, though they spat his name with contempt, could not help replaying his words when they lay awake at night. The fear of imitation, more than the killings, more than the trial. What terrified the white population was the possibility of repetition. If one enslaved man could reinvent himself as a preacher, infiltrate parlors and pulpits, and command loyalty across county lines, what was to prevent others from doing the same? Militias doubled their patrol. Laws grew harsher. Slaves were forbidden from gathering without a white overseer present. Preachers of color were outlawed entirely. Even free black men found themselves shackled by new curfews and restrictions. The mere possession of a Bible could now be grounds for suspicion. The rebellion had killed 17 masters. The fear it left behind shackled thousands more. Eleanor Crenshaw's burden. No one carried the weight of the revolt more visibly than Eleanor Crenshaw. Though spared by Josiah at Cedar Grove, she never fully recovered from the night when the knife traced her throat. Neighbors whispered that she had defended him in court, that she had spoken of his brilliance rather than his savagery. Some accused her of secret sympathy. Others pitied her for being bewitched by a man's silver tongue. Her husband Henry, though outwardly loyal to planter society, grew increasingly embittered. In private he raged that Eleanor had shamed their name by humanizing a murderer. Their marriage fractured, though appearances were kept for the sake of propriety. Years later, Eleanor confided to her daughter, "When I looked into Josiah's eyes, I did not see a beast. I saw a widower, who had buried his heart long before the gallows claimed his body. If that makes me a traitor in their eyes, so be it, but I will not pretend the truth is otherwise." Marcus and the survivors of Josiah's followers, only a handful escaped death or capture. Marcus, the young courier who had once pleaded with him to surrender, vanished into the swamps of eastern Carolina. Some claimed he reached the north and told the tale to abolitionists. Others whispered he was still in the south, moving from plantation to plantation, sowing the seeds of rebellion with every sermon he delivered in secret. Dr. Hartwell, meanwhile, retreated further into his work. Though celebrated for helping to subdue the uprising, he was never free of the gnawing guilt. His journals record a man haunted by contradictions. "I defended law but betrayed conscience. I preserved order, but strangled justice." The gallows silenced Freeman, yet his words echo in my sleep more vividly than any cry for mercy I have ever heard in the sick room. His writings, unpublished in his lifetime, would later be unearthed by his descendants, a startling testament to the inner conflict of those who served both medicine and a system built on the spreading legend. By the 1840s, the story of Josiah Freeman had already mutated into folklore. Among the enslaved, he became less a man than a symbol. They told stories of a preacher who could not be killed, whose body swung but whose spirit walked the fields at night, whispering promises of deliverance. Children were hushed to sleep with the phrase, "Josiah walks tonight. Keep your soul ready." For many, he was not a failed rebel but a prophet whose death marked only the first chapter of a longer struggle. Among planters, the legend turned darker. To them, Josiah was the embodiment of treachery, a wolf in shepherd's clothing. Parents warned their children to watch every servant's glance, to question every word spoken in church. The fear that any enslaved man might be another Josiah Freeman corroded trust at its roots. Northern echoes. Word of the revolt did not remain confined to Carolina. Abolitionist presses in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York seized upon the trial transcripts,
Pamphlets quoted his speeches at length, hailing him as proof that the enslaved possessed not only intellect but moral authority. One widely circulated tract, the Freeman Testimony, reprinted his words, "When you turn men into property, do not be surprised when they rise to reclaim their humanity." For Northerners weary of cautious appeals, his defiance was electrifying. Southern leaders feared. To them, the North was elevating a murderer into a martyr, but in attempting to suppress the story they only made it spread further like ink seeping across a map. Prophecy fulfilled in shadows. Though the revolt was crushed, its resonance shaped the decades that followed. Each new rumor of insurrection, each whisper of a planned uprising, was measured against the memory of when Nat Turner's rebellion was recalled. Freeman's name was often spoken in the same breath, though the two had never met. To some, Turner was the blade, Freeman the tongue. One drew blood, the other revealed truth. By the eve of the Civil War, abolitionists invoked him as evidence of the enslaved spirit's resilience. Confederate sympathizers spat his name as a curse, insisting that Freeman's spawn were at the root of Northern fanaticism. The Crenshaw manuscripts, in 1872, long after emancipation, a cache of documents surfaced in a Wilmington attic. Letters, diaries and testimonies preserved by Eleanor Crenshaw's descendants. They included her personal reflections on the revolt, as well as partial transcripts of Josiah's trial. Published under the title The Crenshaw Papers, the collection reignited debate about his legacy. Some historians dismissed them as embellished, others hailed them as the clearest window into a rebellion, long buried by fear and censorship. What remained beyond dispute was that the revolt of 1835 was no longer a forgotten local tragedy. It had become a chapter in the larger American struggle over freedom and bondage. The shadow that endures. Nearly 2 centuries later, historians still debate Josiah Freeman's place in the pantheon of resistance. Was he a murderer, a prophet, or both? Was his rebellion doomed from the start, or was it a spark that simply fell upon soil not yet dry enough to ignite? What cannot be denied is the endurance of his shadow. The 17 dead masters of Halifax County faded into statistics, their names remembered only in genealogy. But the name Freeman, born of bondage, claimed in defiance, endures in whispers, in sermons, in songs passed down through generations. Dr. Hartwell's final journal entry perhaps captured it best. The gallows ended his breath, but not his voice. That voice will haunt this nation, until the day it decides whether to bury its chains or to bury its conscience. Closing reflection. The summer of 1835 in North Carolina remains America's bloodiest month of enslaved revolt. 17 masters lay dead, but thousands more discovered that their dominion was neither eternal nor unchallenged. The preacher they called Josiah Cumberland, unmasked as Josiah Freeman, left behind not just corpses and crosses, but a question that would stalk the nation until the cannons of the Civil War roared. What happens when the enslaved refuse to suffer in silence? The answer, then as now, lingers in the uneasy silence between memory and prophecy. The rebellion of Josiah Freeman had ended in rope and ash, yet its afterlife was just beginning. In the months following the gallows, Halifax County transformed into a crucible of paranoia. If Part 4 traced the legacy of Freeman's defiance in memory and manuscript, then Part 5 belongs to the shadow world of medicine, law and science. The attempts of the living to dissect, categorize and explain away what had transpired. It is here that the story grows darker, for the pursuit of knowledge often became an alibi for cruelty. Dissection at the gallows.
In October of 1835, after Freeman's execution, his body was not quietly buried. Instead, it was handed over to physicians under the pretense of scientific inquiry. Alpheus Carr, a physician from Raleigh, wrote in his notes, "The subject was of extraordinary physique, taller than most, with muscular density uncommon for his age. The cranium, once shaved, presented a slope more akin to the Anglo than to the African, suggesting admixture. The jaw, however, displayed the pragmatism typical of his race. Carr and his colleagues sought in bone and sinew what they could not bear to admit in spirit, intelligence, strategy and conviction. They prodded his skull, weighed his brain, and etched crude measurements in ledgers. They hoped to locate rebellion not in history but in anatomy, as though treachery were a matter of bone thickness or cranial angle. When their findings proved inconclusive, they adjusted the language rather than the premise. The subject exhibited unnatural cunning, attributable not to true intelligence but to mimicry and deviance. In this way, science bent itself to prejudice, the science of denial. Freeman's revolt arrived at a moment when pseudosciences, such as phrenology and racial anthropology, were spreading across the South. Planters, unnerved by his eloquence and planning, demanded explanations that would preserve their ideology. Thus emerged pamphlets that claimed the preacher's powers of persuasion were products of derangement. Others argued his charisma was evidence of white blood contamination, as though defiance itself must have been inherited from European ancestry. One particularly chilling tract, The Freeman Cranium, published in Charleston in 1836, warned readers that mulattoes, especially when gifted with literacy, present peculiar dangers to the established order, being endowed with the passions of the African and the intellect of the white. It was not a scientific discovery, but a coded call for harsher restrictions. The courthouse fire. Amidst this scramble to control the narrative, much of the primary record was lost in a courthouse fire in 8. Officially, the blaze was attributed to accidental ignition. Unofficially, whispers abounded that men of influence had torched the building deliberately. Why? Because hidden in those records were testimonies too dangerous to preserve. Testimonies in which enslaved men and women spoke not as brutes but as human beings with reason, memory, and grief. Testimonies in which Eleanor Crenshaw admitted, under oath, that Freeman's words had shaken her faith in the very system she lived by. With the records gone, history could be rewritten. In planter circles, the rebellion became a cautionary tale of barbarism rather than a declaration of humanity. Yet memory is not so easily burned. Survivors carried the truth in secret, passing it down in story and song. Medical case files. Dr. Hartwell, unlike Carr, resisted reducing Freeman to an anatomical specimen. In his personal journals he recorded not measurements but impressions. The man's bearing was not of madness, but of mourning. His pulse, when taken, was steady, his speech coherent, his logic without fracture. The state may call him deranged, but medicine can. Yet Hartwell's refusal to endorse pseudoscience left him isolated. He was ridiculed by peers, accused of sentimentality unbecoming a physician. His reputation dimmed, and so, in time, he withdrew, his writings locked in a trunk that would not be opened until nearly a century later. What survived were fragments, letters, and notebooks, each bearing witness to a struggle not merely between master and slave, but between truth and the machinery of denial. The social experiment. In 1836, alarmed by the spread of Freeman's legend, plantation owners began experimenting with new methods of control. Some attempted what they called moral improvement, forcing slaves to attend carefully monitored sermons delivered by white preachers who emphasized obedience and damnation. Others turned to harsher tactics, nightly inspections, the confiscation of books, the punishment of even whispered prayer. What they did not understand was that repression only deepened the resolve of those who remembered Freeman. Secret gatherings multiplied. The preacher's name was invoked in hidden hymns. Wooden crosses began appearing again, carved not as threats but as talismans of hope. In trying to excise the memory, they ensured its persistence. The Panic of 1837. Then came the economic collapse. The Panic of 1837, which struck the South as hard as the North. Plantations faltered, debts mounted, and fear once again returned to the country. Rumors of another uprising flared with each bankruptcy, each whispered quarrel between overseer and slave. Planters remembered Freeman not merely as a man, but as a specter, who seemed to rise whenever the system showed crack. As one newspaper put it, the ghost of Halifax stalks the field still, though the man is long in the grave. Pseudoscience meets prophecy. Perhaps the cruelest irony of this period lies in the collision between two forms of interpretation, the pseudo-scientific and the prophetic. Physicians dissected Freeman's corpse in search of deviance, while enslaved families carried forward his prophecies of deliverance. Each camp in its own way sought to explain the revolt. One looked to bone and blood, the other to scripture and spirit. Yet both agreed on one thing: Josiah Freeman was not easily forgotten. The cost of forgetting. For white society, forgetting was a necessity. To admit Freeman's humanity was to admit the inhumanity of slavery, and so they buried him in ridicule, in pseudoscience, in flame. But for the enslaved, forgetting was impossible. Every lash of the whip, every family torn apart, was proof that Freeman's words had not died with him. They remembered his prophecy, that a reckoning would come not in crosses on doorposts but in a greater conflagration. And indeed, that reckoning lay only decades ahead, waiting in the smoke of cannon fire. Closing reflection. Part 5 reveals that the aftermath of the revolt was not only political but profoundly medical, scientific and cultural. Freeman's body became a battlefield upon which science attempted to erase humanity, while memory kept insisting upon it. The anatomy of fear was not found in skulls or skin. It was found in the lengths to which a society would go to preserve its own illusion. And though Freeman's body was cut, measured and buried, the true dissection was of the conscience of a nation. If Part 5 traced how science, medicine and law sought to explain Josiah Freeman away, then Part 6 turns to the undercurrents that refused erase. Beneath the surface of planter society, hidden roads and whispered alliances were already forming. The rebellion of 1835 had not been an isolated flare of madness. It was one spark in a wider constellation, one link in a chain that would in time stretch north to freedom. This is the story of how silence became a weapon, how secrets were passed between cabins and courthouses, and how Freeman's prophecy lived on, not in courtrooms or dissection tables but in the shadows of the underground. Rumors in the quarters. By 1836, less than a year after Freeman's execution, whispers spread across plantations in Halifax, Warren and Edgecombe counties. Men and women who had once been skeptical of the preacher now recited his words in secret. In the slave quarters, coded hymns carried meaning beyond worship. A verse about crossing the Jordan spoke not of heaven but of the Roanoke River. A refrain about a train bound for glory hinted at secret wagons and northern road. Owners noticed the songs but dismissed them as harmless religion. What they failed to hear was a language of resistance, hidden in plain sight. The Quaker connection. Unbeknownst to many planters, Quaker families in Guilford and Randolph counties were already experimenting with covert acts of defiance. Some provided forged travel passes, others shelter for runaway. One such family, the Worths, maintained correspondence with northern abolitionists. In a letter dated 1837, Nathaniel Worth wrote, "The tale of the Halifax preacher has reached even here, though the man himself perished. His warning has stirred the conscience of some who once remained silent. If we cannot strike openly, we may yet aid quietly. The cause of liberty advances most securely in silence." These words marked the slow knitting together of two worlds, the enslaved who dreamed of escape, and the sympathetic few who risked their lives to help. Marcus's burden. Among those who carried the deepest scars of Freeman's conspiracy was Marcus, the young man who had convinced the preacher to surrender. After the trial, Marcus lived under a cloud of suspicion. White society saw him as dangerous for having been so close to rebellion. Black society distrusted him for betraying a leader. Yet Marcus endured, working quietly, observing, listening. By the late 1830s, evidence suggests Marcus became a crucial intermediary. Oral tradition holds that he was among the first to guide fugitives from Halifax to safe farms further inland. His knowledge of Freeman's maps, seized but partly memorized, allowed him to chart hidden crossings along the Roanoke. Marcus never sought recognition. His silence was his protection, but in silence he turned guilt into action. The Overseer's Ledger. In 1839, an overseer at a plantation outside Enfield recorded a curious entry in his account book. 4 head absent, 2 women, 2 boys. Tracks lead toward the river. No trace found. Suspect help from without. Perhaps the preacher's ghost at work again. The language is chilling in its dismissal. Human beings reduced to head, yet hidden within is proof escapes were happening, and slaveholders attributed them not to chance but to the lingering influence of Freeman. The more they sought to suppress his memory, the more they believed in it. Eleanor Crenshaw's transformation. Meanwhile, Eleanor Crenshaw, widow of the man slain by Freeman, retreated from society life. She refused marriage proposals, ceased hosting social gatherings, and turned increasingly toward a private form of contrition. Neighbors whispered that she had gone mad, praying at all hours, scribbling long letters that she never sent. Yet fragments of her papers reveal a mind profoundly altered. "We once thought the preacher a beast, yet I cannot forget the steadiness of his eyes, nor his words, nor the grief that seemed larger than rage. If such a man is a beast, then what are we who made him so?" Though her influence in political circles waned, her private reflections became a kind of moral underground of their own. Servants repeated her softer words in the quarters, where they spread like balm among those who had suffered under her husband's rule.
The Northern Gaze. News of Freeman's revolt traveled slowly but surely northward. By the early 1840s, abolitionist papers such as The Liberator referenced the bloody cross of Halifax as proof of the brutality of slavery. Writers drew parallels between Freeman's sermon at Cedar Grove and Nat Turner's uprising 4 years earlier. In Boston, a lecturer proclaimed, "The South burns its records, but the truth rises in smoke visible even here. They hang the preacher, but his sermon is carried on the lips of every child torn from its mother." This reframing transformed Freeman from villain to martyr in Northern eyes. For Southern authorities, such portrayals confirmed their worst fears. Rebellion was not only local but national. Codes and crosses. One of the strangest legacies of Freeman's revolt was the persistence of his symbol, the carved cross. After 1835, planters treated any appearance of crude wooden crosses as potential evidence of conspiracy. Patrols were ordered to destroy them on sight, yet the more they were erased, the more they appeared. In one plantation journal from 1841, a frustrated overseer noted, "Another cross carved into the stable beam. This is the fourth since Easter. Cannot stamp it out." Among the enslaved, the cross had shifted meaning. Once a mark of intended bloodshed, it now stood for faith, hope, and endurance. To carve a cross was to remember Freeman without speaking his name. The fearful response. The white community's response grew harsh. Laws tightened, literacy punishments stiffened, religious meetings curtailed, patrols expanded, but fear remained. In 1842, when lightning struck a barn near Halifax, killing several animals, locals whispered it was Freeman's curse. A decade later, when another preacher preached too passionately, he was driven from the county with threats of hanging. The revolt had created not just memory but a reflex of paranoia, and paranoia, in turn, created the very conditions for further resistance. Marcus's final testament. In 1878, more than 40 years later, Marcus, then an old man, spoke at last to a journalist. His words, carried in brittle ink, have survived. "They say I betrayed him. Perhaps I did, but I also carried his map in my head. I carried his prophecy in my heart, and I carried his people across the river, one by one, until my legs could carry no more. If I saved him from hanging that night, perhaps it was so his sermon might be heard at the gallows, and so his ghost might walk beside us on the road to freedom." Marcus's testimony is both confession and vindication. In silence he had done what Freeman himself could not: turn rebellion into escape, prophecy into survival. Closing reflection. Part 6 shows that though Josiah Freeman's body swung lifeless in 1835, his revolt did not end at the gallows. It lived on in whispers, in songs, in coded crosses, in the footsteps of fugitives who vanished into northern roads. Rebellion shifted form, from open bloodshed to silent networks. What could not be carved in wood was carved in memory. What could not be shouted in sermons was sung in code. The silent network became the truest proof of Freeman's prophecy, that other men would rise, other paths would open, and one day the great sin of slavery would demand its accounting. If Part 6 traced the hidden network that carried Freeman's spirit into silence, then Part 7 returns us to fire. For silence cannot last forever. Songs, whispers and coded crosses were enough to sustain, but history bends back toward eruption. The 1835 revolt had planted a seed of fear in North Carolina's soil, but also a seed of resolve. By the mid-1840s, new waves of unrest, small and large, swept through the South. In these tremors, Freeman's prophecy stirred once again. The year of whispers. In 1844, nearly a decade after Freeman's execution, patrols in Halifax County reported a troubling pattern. Groups of enslaved men were found loitering in fields at night, speaking in hushed tones. Others disappeared for hours at a time, only to return without explanation. An overseer's report from that year reads, "There is talk again of Moses, or a prophet like him. They say the blood of 17 is not yet answered. I do not like the look in their eyes when they are asked about it." The reference to Moses is striking. Freeman's followers had often called him by that name in secret. Nearly 10 years later, the title persists. The children of the revolt. By the 1840s, a new generation had grown. Children who had been infants during Freeman's rebellion, now reaching their teens. To them, the preacher was less a man than a legend, a ghost whispered about in song and sermon. A story circulated that Freeman had not died at all but had escaped, traveling north to gather armies. He would return, some said with black regiments and northern allies. Of course this was myth, but myth, in the quarters, mattered more than fact. It gave hope to the hopeless, fire to the weary, Eleanor's letter to Boston. Eleanor Crenshaw, the widow-turned-recluse, continued her strange correspondence. In 1846, a letter addressed to a Boston abolitionist was intercepted by authorities.
It read, in part, "Though I do not dare speak openly, I cannot abide silence. The death of Freeman has haunted me as a spectre. His words were not madness, but judgment. If the North would ever move, let them remember Halifax, for it was here that the earth drank 17 masters in 1 month, and still it thirsts for more." The letter was seized, and Eleanor placed under informal watch. But the damage was done. Her words had leaked, joining the abolitionist arsenal. Northern papers printed the tale with relish, portraying her as a reluctant witness to Southern sin. The river crossing. In 1847, Marcus, now older, slower but still guiding fugitives, played a part in one of the most daring escapes since the Revolt. A group of 11 men and women crossed the Roanoke in a stolen skiff. Pursued by dogs and armed patrols, they vanished into the woods beyond. Planters raged, convinced that the Freeman network had aided them. No proof was found, but suspicion poisoned every interaction. One planter wrote bitterly, "The war is not against Yankees, but against ghosts. Freeman's name is spoken still. He is everywhere, and nowhere. If I burn every Bible, they will preach his words from memory." Nat Turner's shadow. It was not only Freeman's memory that haunted the South. Nat Turner's revolt of 1831, though crushed, lingered like smoke. Together, Turner and Freeman became paired in Southern imagination, the twin phantoms of Black Rebellion. By the 1850s, the phrase "another Turner, another Freeman" became shorthand for disaster. Mothers frightened their children with it. Politicians invoked it in speeches. Patrol captains used it to justify harsher laws. But for the enslaved, the names meant hope. Turner and Freeman were proof that resistance was possible, that the chains were not unbreakable. The sermon at Willow Oaks. In 1851, a traveling black preacher named Isaiah led a clandestine service at Willow Oaks, a plantation near Halifax. Witnesses later claimed he invoked Freeman directly, saying, "He who was hanged in 35 yet lives in the spirit." He spoke of rivers, and rivers have opened. He spoke of blood, and blood yet cries from the ground. The masters tremble because they know the prophecy is not finished. The gathering was raided. Isaiah was beaten nearly to death and expelled from the camp, but his words echoed long after, carried in song and story. Eleanor's final days. By the late 1850s, Eleanor Crenshaw's health declined. She lived alone in a decaying house, her servants dwindling as more escaped or were sold. In her final journal, discovered after her death, she wrote, "I have seen visions of the preacher in my dreams. He stands at the foot of my bed, neither accusing nor forgiving. I think perhaps he waits, not for me but for the land itself to reckon with what was done." Her death in 1859 coincided eerily with another great spark, John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. To some abolitionists, the timing seemed providential, one guilty witness passing as a new prophet rose. The road to war. By 1860, the South was a tinderbox. Every escape, every rumor, every sermon was interpreted through the lens of Freeman and Turner. When Lincoln's election sent shockwaves through the slave states, many recalled the Halifax Revolt as evidence that slavery could not be contained forever. Confederate leaders cited such uprisings as justification for secession. They claimed that without independence the South would drown in blood like that spilled in 18. In this twisted way, Freeman's ghost marched the South into war. Marcus's last crossing. In 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, Marcus made one final journey. Though nearly 70, he guided a small group of fugitives across the Roanoke. Among them was a boy of 15 who carried a crude wooden cross carved from pine. When asked why he bore it, the boy replied, "It is the mark of Moses. My father told me to carry it, for it opens the way." Marcus wept. He had seen the prophecy live on, passed to a new generation. Days later, he collapsed from exhaustion and died quietly by the riverbank. His body was buried in secret. No stone marked his grave, but the fugitives remembered, and in their memory the map of escape continued. The prophecy fulfilled. When Union troops marched into North Carolina in 1865, some freedmen whispered that Freeman had returned at last, not in person, but in the blue uniforms of Northern soldiers. To them, Emancipation was the final echo of his sermon, the fulfillment of his words at Cedar Grove. The land shall not be cleansed until the masters have drunk the cup they poured. 17 masters had fallen in 1835. 30 years later, the entire slave system collapsed. Freeman's prophecy, born in blood, had outlived gallows, overseers, and chains. Closing reflection, Part 7 reveals the long echo of 1835, showing how Freeman's revolt refused to die. It lived on in rumor, in myth, in sermons, in escapes, and in the very paranoia of the South. Though his rebellion failed in its immediate aim, it succeeded in another. It proved that slavery was never secure, never absolute. His ghost haunted the South until the institution itself crumbled. And so we end with this truth. Josiah Freeman's sermon was not a single event. It was a prophecy carried across decades, whispered from lips to lips, until the whole nation burned. If Part 7 showed how Freeman's prophecy echoed through whispers, Part 8 brings us into the burning crucible of war itself. For the Civil War was not only a clash of armies and governments, it was, in the minds of many freedmen and planters alike, the long-delayed fulfillment of Freeman's warning. The Union marched south. In the spring of 1865, Union troops pushed into North Carolina. Soldiers camped near the same fields where Freeman had preached 3 decades earlier. Reports describe freedmen flocking to the camps, some carrying makeshift crosses of wood or rope. One Union chaplain wrote, "They come not merely as liberated bondsmen, but as disciples of an old prophet. They whisper of a Moses hanged in 35, who said the land would not rest until the masters were overthrown. They say we are his army." For the soldiers, this was strange folklore, but for the freed it was vindication. The prophecy had ripened at last. Eleanor's house in ruin, the Crenshaw estate, once a symbol of Southern permanence, lay in ruin by the war's end. Eleanor herself was dead, her journals scattered. Union troops burned parts of the house, leaving only the brick chimneys and a half-collapsed parlor. Local freedmen, it is said, avoided the ruins. They claimed Eleanor's spirit lingered there, still pacing the halls, still whispering to unseen visitors. Children crossing the grounds would make the sign of the cross in the air, muttering, "The widow walked." Even in death, her complicity and her strange fascination with Freeman kept her tethered to the land. Marcus remembered. Though Marcus had died in 1861, his name lived on in secret network. Those he guided across the Roanoke spoke of him as a saint, a ferryman who delivered souls from bondage. After emancipation, some of his kin returned to the riverbank and planted cedar saplings in his honor. By the 1870s, locals spoke of the cedar crossings, where trees grew in unnatural clusters, their branches twisting into shapes resembling crosses. Travelers at dusk claimed to see a shadowy figure among them, an old man with a lantern, waiting by the water's edge. The testimony of the freed. The Freedmen's Bureau recorded hundreds of testimonies from former slaves in Halifax County. Many spoke of the revolt of 1835, with a reverence bordering on religious. One man, identified only as Elias, declared, "I was a boy when they hung Moses Freeman. I saw the dogs bite him. They thought they killed him, but he lived on in us. Every lash I took, I remembered him. Every hymn I sang, I called his name. When the Yankees came, I knew it was him come back." For officials, this was troubling. They wanted reconciliation, not the revival of old rebellions, but they could not erase the memory. The Southern counter-narrative. White planters told a different story. To them, Freeman's revolt was not prophecy, but madness, proof that black freedom would mean endless bloodshed. Southern newspapers in the Reconstruction era retold the tale with venom, painting Freeman as a fanatic who slaughtered without reason. They emphasized the deaths of the 17 masters, while erasing the chains, whips and broken families that birthed the revolt. This rewriting of history became part of the lost cause myth, where Freeman was not a prophet but a devil. But truth has a way of surviving even deliberate forgetting. The children of the prophecy. By the 1880s, children of freedmen carried Freeman's story into black churches and schools. Preachers invoked him as a forerunner of liberation. Teachers wrote his name in chalk beside Lincoln's, pairing the prophet and the president as partners in freedom. In secret societies, crosses were carved on lodge doors, each one a reminder of the blood that had purchased liberty. The prophecy became less about vengeance and more about resilience,
a lesson that the oppressed could rise, endure and carve justice, even from cruelty. The Scholar's Dilemma. In 1892, a young historian named Thomas Wilcox uncovered fragments of court transcripts from the 18th. He attempted to publish a study on Freeman's Revolt, but Southern presses refused. One editor wrote, "This history serves no one, it grants dignity to a murderer, and sows division in a nation still healing." Wilcox's manuscript was buried in an archive, forgotten for decades. Only in the 20th century would researchers rediscover it, restoring Freeman's words to print. The ghost at Cedar Grove. Local law in Halifax insisted that the old meeting ground at Cedar Grove was haunted. Farmers refused to build on the site. Children dared one another to step across it at night. They claimed to hear sermons in the wind, a deep voice calling from the trees, "The land shall not be cleansed until the cup is full." On stormy nights, crude wooden crosses were said to appear in the mud, marks no hand confessed to carving. By morning they were gone. Skeptics dismissed it as superstition, but the fear endured, woven into the soil. It's the long shadow of 1835. By the turn of the century, Freeman's Revolt had faded from mainstream history, overshadowed by larger wars and movements. Yet in black families, it remained a whispered inheritance. Grandmothers told it to grandchildren as both warning and promise, that freedom came only through struggle, and that the dead could still speak through the living. Meanwhile, in Southern white families, the story survived as a cautionary tale of betrayal, a reason to cling tighter to segregation and control. Two versions of history, one of liberation, one of fear, coexisted in tension, both traced back to those 28 days. In closing reflection,
Part 8 reveals the aftermath of Freeman's prophecy through war, ruin, and memory. It shows how his revolt was claimed by different voices, a ghost story for some, a scripture for others, a threat for those who feared change. And though decades passed, the crosses remained in song, in sermons, in cedar trees, in scars carved into the land. For history does not vanish, it lingers in ruins, in whispers, in the restless dead. And in Halifax, the blood of 17 masters and the vision of one preacher continued to speak long after gallows turned to dust. If Part 8 lingered in the ruins and memory of Freeman's prophecy, then Part 9 confronts us with its scale. For revolts do not end when gallows swing. They echo in archives, in politics, in bloodlines. And when measured against the vast machinery of slavery, Freeman's rebellion, brief as it was, forces us to reckon with an arithmetic that is as chilling as it is inexorable. 17 against thousands. The revolt of 1835 took the lives of 17 masters. To white society, this was a massacre. To the enslaved, it was but a fraction of the suffering already endured. In Halifax County alone, census records show over 10,000 enslaved people living under bondage that year. Each represented a life measured in lashes, separations, hunger, and forced labor. Each bore witness to cruelties far exceeding those 17 deaths. And so Freeman's revolt, violent as it was, becomes a mirror. It reflected back to the oppressors only the smallest measure of the violence they themselves had long inflicted. The crosses as ledger. Freeman's crude wooden crosses, planted at the doors of the dead, were more than symbol. They were entries in a moral ledger. Each cross stood for a debt unpaid, a wound unhealed. One planter's widow recalled with trembling voice, "It was as if he meant to mark us for judgment, as the Hebrews did in Egypt. Only this time the angel passed not over, but through." In this reading, the revolt was theology made visible, not random slaughter but the arithmetic of prophecy, blood answering blood, crosses tallying sins too long ignored, the cost of silence. In the decades that followed, silence became the South's chosen response. Families erased the memory of the revolt, refusing to speak Freeman's name. Courthouse fires conveniently destroyed trial records. Churches that once hosted his sermons were dismantled or abandoned. But silence has its own cost. Suppressed memory returns in ghostly form, dreams, whispers, superstitions. By refusing to reckon honestly with 1835, the South allowed it to fester. The silence was not healing but infection. The war's terrible mathematics. When civil war erupted, the arithmetic multiplied beyond all imagination. Over 600,000 lives were lost in 4 years of carnage. For some, this was the ultimate fulfillment of Freeman's prophecy. A Union officer, reflecting in 1865, wrote, "The land has been bathed in blood, not of 17 but of hundreds of thousands. If this is judgment, it is judgment vast enough to break a nation." Here lies the chilling parallel. The 17 masters of 1835 were but the beginning of a far greater reckoning, a down payment on a debt the nation had deferred too long. The moral reckoning. Historians have argued that revolts like Freeman's, though rare, forced America to confront truths it preferred to ignore. They revealed that slavery was not a benign institution but a system sustained only through terror. Freeman's revolt in particular demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of organization, planning, and theological reflection. They were not property, but human beings who resisted with the tools available to them, whether through escape, song, or sword. And yet the moral reckoning was incomplete. Emancipation freed bodies, but not fully souls. Systems of oppression simply reshaped themselves into sharecropping, segregation, and disenfranchisement. Freeman's prophecy in that sense remains unfinished. Eleanor's shadow in Reconstruction. Even in death, Eleanor Crenshaw lingered as a symbol of the South's divided conscience. Her journals, smuggled north, became rare artifacts cited by abolitionists as evidence of Southern hypocrisy. But in Halifax, her name was spoken with venom. White neighbors called her the widow who betrayed us. Freedmen remembered her uneasily, as both witness and accomplice, too fascinated with Freeman to condemn him, too complicit to be redeemed. Her shadow illustrates the ambiguity of moral reckoning. Some saw and trembled, yet still could not act. Marcus's arithmetic. Marcus, the ferryman, embodied a different arithmetic. He did not count crosses or deaths, but lives delivered across the river. Each fugitive he guided was to him a subtraction from slavery's sum. By the time of his death, he had helped dozens, perhaps hundreds, escape. His ledger was not of blood but of salvation, carved in hidden paths and whispered direction. When told of Freeman's prophecy, he once replied, "I reckon judgment comes in many ways, sometimes in fire, sometimes in footsteps across a river." The historian's burden. For those who dig in archives today, the revolt of 1835 presents a challenge. Records are scarce, often deliberately erased. Testimonies are fragmentary, filtered through hostile courts and fearful witnesses, yet enough survives to reconstruct its outline. A preacher, a prophecy, 17 dead, and a community scar. The historian's task is not only to piece together events, but to weigh their meaning, what they reveal about power, resistance, and the human soul. And in that weighing, Freeman's revolt becomes more than an episode. It becomes a parable of arithmetic, the cost of oppression, the price of silence, the compound interest of injustice. The legacy in bloodlines, perhaps the most haunting arithmetic, is genealogical. The descendants of masters and slaves still walk the same soil in Halifax. Some carry names passed down from planters, others from fugitives. Some may unknowingly share bloodlines divided by chains and cruelty. And though they may not speak Freeman's name, his revolt lives in their veins. History is not abstract. It is inherent. The crosses carved in 1835 still cast shadows over families today. Closing reflection. Part 9 forces us to confront the true scale of Freeman's revolt. Not only the 17 masters slain, but the tens of thousands enslaved, the hundreds of thousands killed in war, and the countless generations shaped by both. It reveals that history is an arithmetic written in blood and silence, in crosses planted and rivers crossed, and though ledger books may burn, the sums remain. For Freeman's prophecy was never just about Halifax. It was about America itself, a nation built on bondage, destined to pay a price too vast for any one revolt to settle. The question that remains, haunting unanswered, is whether the ledger has ever truly closed. History records endings with blunt efficiency, dates, verdicts, death. But the revolt of 1835 did not end with Josiah Freeman's execution, nor with the courthouse fire, nor even with emancipation. Its aftermath lingered like smoke in a burned house, clinging to rafters and clothing, seeping into lungs long after the flames had died. If there is closure, it is not in justice, but in the haunting knowledge that some events refuse to stay buried. The collapse of the Crenshaw line. The Crenshaw family never recovered from the revolt. Their fortune dwindled within a generation. Eleanor, though she lived another 12 years after the trial, became a recluse. Visitors recalled her pacing the abandoned halls of Cedar Grove, speaking aloud to ghosts no one else could see. When she died in 1847, her will left no heir. The plantation passed through creditors' hands, stripped of its grandeur, and gradually reclaimed by forest. By the 1860s, travelers described Cedar Grove as a ruin, its verandas sagging, its fields gone to seed, its once proud house rotting like a corpse. Local children dared one another to enter the grounds. They spoke of hearing whispers in the slave quarters at dusk, of crosses carved in trees that no one could explain. Some claimed that Eleanor herself walked the halls in her widow's dress, eternally waiting for an answer to questions no court had ever allowed her to ask. Hartwell's quiet torment. Dr. Silas Hartwell, who had urged Freeman to surrender, carried his own burden. His medical journals, unearthed decades later, reveal a man torn between science and conscience. He dissected not only bodies, but society itself, tracing the pathologies of slavery as though they were tumors metastasizing through the nation. "I preserved lives," he wrote in 1836, "yet in so doing I preserved the very institution that destroys them. I wonder if I did right to stay the knife." Hartwell never recovered from that doubt. He practiced medicine until 1859, his hands steady, his diagnoses precise. But in his private writings, he grew increasingly preoccupied with the idea that Freeman's revolt was not a singular event, but evidence of a deeper epidemic. His last recorded words before death were chilling: "The disease is systemic, and we are all infected." Marcus and the river. Marcus lived longest of all the witnesses. Through him, Freeman's story survived in whispers. He ferried fugitives across the Roanoke for years, his silence broken only in old age when he gave interviews to northern journalists hungry for first-hand accounts of slavery. They expected fiery speeches. What they received were quiet reflections. Freeman was not saint nor devil, Marcus said in 8. He was a man stripped of all else, left with rage and scripture. He carved his crosses in wood because he could not carve them in stone. He wanted the world to reckon, but reckonings are slow things. Sometimes they take lifetimes. Marcus died in 1881, buried on unmarked ground near the very river that had borne so many to freedom. Local freedmen placed a crude wooden cross at his grave. Some swore it was meant as tribute to Freeman, others as defiance against forgetting. Either way, it rotted into the soil, becoming part of the landscape, inseparable from the earth itself. The disappearance of the evidence, much of what might have preserved Freeman's conspiracy vanished. The courthouse fire of 1863 consumed official trial records. Cedar Grove's decline erased the physical traces, the carved crosses, the hidden caches. Freeman's journals, seized by the sheriff, disappeared into state archives that were later misplaced or deliberately destroyed. What remains are fragments: a widow's scandalous testimony, a doctor's haunted journals, a ferryman's reluctant recollections, and the terrified letters of planters who survived. From these, historians piece together a story that is both vivid and incomplete, precise and elusive. It is perhaps fitting that the revolt survives only in shards. Full records would domesticate it, tame its horror into tidy narrative. Instead, it lingers like a half-remembered nightmare, real enough to disturb, uncertain enough to haunt. Folklore and fear. By the late 19th century, Freeman's revolt had already passed into folklore. White families recast him as a demon or conjureman, a figure who had bewitched gullible slaves with forbidden charm. Preachers thundered that his rebellion was the work of Satan, a warning against literacy and religious gatherings among the enslaved. Among black communities, his legend split into two streams. Some saw him as martyr, his prophecy fulfilled by emancipation. Others whispered uneasily, believing his methods too soaked in blood to honor. Stories told of his restless spirit still walking the woods, carving invisible crosses on the doors of the wicked. In both tellings, he was no longer simply a man, but a presence, a cautionary figure invoked in sermons, songs and fireside tales. The ledger unclosed. What haunts most is not the violence itself, but the arithmetic behind it. 17 masters dead in 1835, hundreds of thousands dead by one man hanged before a crowd, millions enslaved across generations. The arithmetic never balanced. Freeman believed blood would force America to reckon. Instead, the nation paid in installments: war, reconstruction, segregation, lynching, debts compounding across centuries. Some argue the ledger remains open still, each injustice unaddressed, each silence maintained, is another line written beneath Freeman's crosses. The modern echo. Today, Cedar Grove is gone, its ruins swallowed by forest,
The Crenshaw name is scarcely remembered outside county record, yet Freeman's story surfaces in unexpected places. A passing mention in a university lecture, a half-legible article in a local newspaper, a genealogy that reveals old bloodlines intertwined. Visitors to Halifax sometimes claim the air thickens near the old plantation ground. Hunters report finding crosses, carved high in trees, weathered but unmistakable. Skeptics dismiss them as idle vandalism. Believers insist the marks are older than the bark itself, grown into the trees as though nature remembers what men tried to forget. A whispered warning. As night falls over the fields where Freeman once preached, one can almost hear it, the faint cadence of scripture twisted into lament, the echo of voices asking if justice ever came. Perhaps the greatest terror is not in what happened but in what remains unresolved. Freeman promised that others would rise, that the reckoning would come, and though decades and wars have passed, the ledger still whispers its arithmetic, daring us to count. Do you hear it? The tallying of debts unpaid, the carving of crosses unseen. Final outro. This concludes the 10-part account of 1835 North Carolina, America's bloodiest slave revolt, 17 masters killed in 1 month. We end not with closure, but with a question. What debts remain on the ledger? Remember, some truths are too powerful to remain buried, and some marks once carved never fade. When you turn off this video and step into the quiet of your own home, ask yourself, what crosses might already be marked upon your door?